Good morning, Victor. It's a pleasure to have this discussion with you here in the context of Copenhagen 2021 World Pride at UN City. We will have a few discussions here about your mandate, what brought you to Copenhagen, and you've been here for a week now, and we've seen the buzzing atmosphere, all around, the discussions, the enriching exchanges between activists and leaders. What is your take from this week? What brought you to Copenhagen 2021 in the first place?
It was originally seen, Alex, as the possibility for the movement to touch back base with a certain periodicity as it used to do. Of course, COVID-19 has come into the picture and has created disruptions in every plant. I think there was a moment where a decision was taken that we were able enough, all of us, to understand what sanitary conditions were going to allow, and at the same time that it was time to ensure that this movement continue galvanizing its energy. One of the things that I really appreciate about the whole organization of this conference is that those behind it have been really careful in ensuring to open as many avenues of inclusivity as possible. And that we are all here with the awareness that the work of togetherness is going to be complemented with notions of responsibility to bring whatever is forged here to the larger movement, including those that for many reasons, including COVID, but also systematic situations of discrimination and violence, have been left out.
Now, Victor, you're the United Nations independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity issues in the context of anti-gender movements that are more and more vocal in many countries. This mandate, which is a relatively new mandate in the UN system, makes even more sense. Can you tell us a few words about the mandate? And you've also issued a report just before the summer, which has made a lot of noise in the good sense. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about both the mandate and the report.
I think, Alex, that the creation of the mandate signaled in 2016 a political achievement in the acknowledgement that gender identity is at the base of much violence and discrimination around the world. But that political messaging, in my view, necessitated to be complemented with a legal analysis of the development of international human rights law that has led to the fact that gender and gender identity have become categories of analysis in violence and discrimination and protected under international human rights law. This report aimed at filling that vacuum. It provides a significant series of analysis in terms of legal aspects of this recognition. And I think most importantly, it goes back to the notion that people experience gender as an interaction with a series of social preconceptions as to how people should behave, what roles they should fill, even how they should dress or how they should express themselves on the basis of the sex that they were assigned at birth. And I have often said in the past, we need to question that preconception, that predetermination of people's fate on the basis of the sex that they were assigned at birth, if we are to enjoy the full gamut of human rights in relation not only to aspects as basic as bodily autonomy and integrity, but in the participation in all aspects of public and private life.
Now, this is the first report that is out. I understand there's also a second report in the making that will probably go public after the summer, or probably will be presented, I guess, to the General Assembly in New York. And there's a lot of work that has been put in this report. What are the main obstacle or hurdles that you have to go through when you are doing this kind of work? And how is it perceived? How is your role, which is quite an unorthodox role, perceived in the wider UN system, and especially with member states that are at the basis of the UN system?
That's an interesting question. I would say, I think the strength of this mandate in the way that it was crafted by the work of civil society and states is that it is a mandate that was new and dealt with an issue that was controversial at the time of creation, but relies upon very orthodox and well-established working methods of the United Nations. So the existence of special procedures and my ability to carry out research, individual case and fact-finding, dialogue and promotion and country visits is part of a very well-established methodology that has been developed during decades. So I rely on that methodology to carry out my work. In the particular case of this research, it was a blatant example of how many people want this mandate to succeed around the world. The call for inputs in the gender report broke every record of submissions. I received more than 640 submissions, extremely substantive inputs in relation to this. So as you can see, there is a facilitating process in the research process that is additional to the desk study that I carry out. This second report, which I will present to the United Nations General Assembly in October and has been already finalized and is in the last stages of editing and translation, interrogates narratives that are exclusionary. And just to not be very cryptic about what that means, they interrogate the narratives that say that gender doesn't exist, or that the legal recognition of gender identity of trans persons is not a protected category under international human rights law. And I'm examining those narratives because I think that they are part of significant cultural conversations right now, where it is on the public discussion whether recognizing the right to legal recognition based on self-identification may be detrimental to the rights of some communities or peoples, such as women and girls. And the conclusion of this report is that there's absolutely no contradiction between the endeavor of recognizing the rights of one community and population that I have mentioned. So hopefully this report is a tool for both states and the civil society when these conversations are going on. It's based on evidence, and it's based on the idea of deconstructing stigma and prejudice around the lives of trans men and women and gender diverse persons.
I think we're very much looking forward to seeing the presentation of that report and to reading it. On the overall question of methodology, as you mentioned, your work heavily, and I mean legitimately so, relies also on the input of civil society in all its variety. Very often the UN seems not extremely well equipped in order to include civil society voices into its work. So this sounds rather like an exception more than the mainstream. Do you think there's something that could be learned from that method for other areas of the work of the UN, especially now in the context of the 75th anniversary, where what is put forward is the need to reach out, the need for more partnership, the need to include civil society, youth, academia more into the work of the UN?
I think that my answer would need to have explore two perspectives. The first one would be, I think that the human rights machinery of the United Nations has for decades now explored in a very, very innovative way what participatory approaches mean. And I think that overall the conclusions that I reached through seeing how civil society actively participates in the UPR process, in all inquiries and processes of the Office of the High Commissioner and her High Commissioner herself, in treaty bodies. You may know I used to be a member of the Subcommittee for Prevention of Torture, where we also relied heavily on civil society, and finally on special procedures and my current work. In all of those, there are inbuilt processes for participation of civil society, and I think that the UN at large, which also is exploring this issue under the developmental framework, for example, and the pillar of peace and security, will benefit at some point to create some sort of good practices and lessons learned across the board in relation to these issues. But I think that there's magnificent experience already created in relation to this, and that speaks to a great degree of the level of competence and dedication of the civil society, which is courageous and principled and competent around the world. That's one aspect, and I think that that can be capitalized upon. For me, the second that I actually would like to mention is, I think that there's an awareness that we also need to acknowledge that civil society comes with different types of input to these processes. Persons contribute their lived experiences. Victims and survivors will contribute their stories. And there is a duty to build frameworks of protection for their integrity and, for example, prevent re-victimization. People are not stories to be exhibited. Stories belong to them, and we need to be very respectful at dealing with them. That's when people share their lived experiences. And then they may share their advocacy and their convictions and what they want to achieve. And then they can share also expertise, because the expertise of people over their own lives is something that is fundamentally important when it comes to building public policy. As an example, I would never dare of imagining a diagnostic and a public policy concerning the health of lesbian women without consulting the lived experience of lesbian women, for example. So I think that in that aspect, I recognize also not only activism and lived experience, but also the inbuilt expertise that is created by analyzing and systematizing those lived experiences. I think the UN is an extraordinary forum for civil society to impact, and hopefully this is a process that will continue.
So basically nothing about us without us, and is that the message you could give to the LGBTI community? The UN is there also for you in this leaving no one behind. You can trust the UN?
Yes, I think that, there's a series of motivating slogans that are very useful because they transmit messages that are very powerful and political intentions. Leaving no one behind is such a case. I mean, the international community has rallied around the idea that we always have to look and begin at the end of the queue, as the wonderful Imania Brown said at the opening of this conference. Rather than just looking back at it, you actually need to go to it and ensure that you work with it. And again, nothing about us without us is an expression of principle that is taken at large from the feminist movement, and now has of course been embraced by communities and populations as a principle of participatory approaches. But I would add one, it's not yet a catchy slogan, I haven't come up with a way to express it, but my advice is that we always ensure that we look around when we're in spaces and that we ask ourselves, who is not here that should be here? And in many cases, that would also imply that we need to learn, because the person who's not here is not here because we didn't know that she existed. It's the case that for a very long time was with trans men and women, or with intersex persons whose lives are condemned to political invisibility because occupying public space is dangerous, risky, and very much punished. And so the question becomes how to create mechanisms so that people have safe spaces to come out and say, I should be counted, I should be invited, and I should be in the room. And I think that each and every time there should be a question that it's an ethical, a political, and a pragmatic imperative of looking around and saying, who is not here that should be here? I hope to live to see a moment where that is no longer the question, and this is why we're working together.
Well, thank you, Victor. I mean, a quick question maybe to close this discussion. After October 2021, what can we expect next from the side of the independent expert on SOGI issues? How does it look? What's the outlook?
The main plan of action of the mandate was crafted in a consultation last year, from which came a plan for 2021-2023. I was very lucky in that consultation received inputs from over 350 people from over 100 countries, people and institutions from over 100 countries. And the outcome of that was a main driver in the thematic agenda, the research agenda of the mandate, which is going to see my preparation of a report on health, right to health and SDG 3 under that aegis. I will then follow with a report on disproportionate impact of armed conflict on LGBT populations and the role of LGBT communities in peace building and peacekeeping. My following report to the Human Rights Council in 2023 will be based on religion and sexual orientation and gender identity. And it's an exploration of the well-known principle that there is not such a thing as a contradiction between right to freedom of religion and belief and the right to freedom of violence and discrimination based on SOGI. But it's going to be an interrogation as to why it's so easy to create that perception in political terms. And finally, my report to the General Assembly in 2023 will be on colonialism and the impact. It's almost like a geological study of the impact of different layers of colonialism in the construction of social mores and legal, social, and political language around sexuality and sexual orientation and gender identity. That will be, if everything goes as planned, of course surrounded by work on individual cases and country visits and my promotional work, which is of course always intense. And we'll see the end of my plan of work as independent expert, because of course by that stage it will be the end of my tenure as independent expert, and it will mean that by that stage hopefully one of the magnificent persons that exist in this field will have been appointed as my successor.